They smiled while burning. That's the first thing anyone remembers, how the victims looked directly into the camera, eyes wide, lips curved, as the flames consumed them. Dead and Buried wasn't just another small-town horror. It was a film that dared to corrupt the idea of peace, of burial, of closure, and it left its fingerprints all over the viewer's sense of safety. Released in 1981 to little fanfare, it was quickly dismissed by critics as a messy amalgam of zombie tropes and gore effects. But the truth? This wasn't a zombie film, it was a resurrection ritual disguised as small-town Americana. Underneath the foggy harbors and the warm handshakes of the town's residents lay a cold, mechanical obsession with controlling life and erasing death. It wasn't entertainment, it was a quiet provocation. The production itself was just as strange. Lawsuits, denials of authorship, a promotional campaign that bordered on funeral pornography, and most infamously, a scene that was flagged not for violence or nudity, but for theological disruption. In recent years, Dead and Buried has clawed its way out of the VHS crypts and gained a cult following, not because of nostalgia, but because it feels more relevant than ever. The questions it raises about identity, surveillance, and the ethics of eternal life echo disturbingly loud in our age of AI and synthetic reality. This isn't just a story about corpses refusing to stay dead. It's about the living refusing to let go. And the more you look into this film, the more it looks back. These are 20 weird facts you didn't know about Dead and Buried, and by the end, you might wish you didn't. Fact 1. The scene that wasn't just bandit was erased. It wasn't blood or nudity that got the censors sweating, it was theology. In the now infamous scene where a burned man suddenly opens his eyes during an autopsy, early UK screenings received a stark classification, X, for disturbing metaphysical implications. The British Board of Film Classification objected not to the gore, but to the idea that death could be a manipulated illusion, orchestrated like a stage play. What unsettled them was the calm, clinical way the film handled resurrection, as if it were procedural, not miraculous. The scene was entirely removed from certain prints in the 1,980 seconds, especially during the video nasty crackdown. Strangely, the American release kept the footage intact, but buried it beneath minimal promotion. When fans later unearthed an uncut VHS tape from Belgium, it sparked whispers that the version shown in theaters wasn't the one the filmmakers wanted you to see. Was this censorship or quiet compliance with something more disturbing? The version of the film you saw might have already been embalmed. Fact 2. Dan O'Bannon tried to disown the script and then changed his mind. Best known for Alien and Total Recall, Dan O'Bannon initially denied having written Dead and Buried. His name appears in the credits. But for years, he distanced himself from the screenplay, claiming that the original draft was altered beyond recognition. Behind the scenes, however, he remained in legal disputes with co-writer Ronald Shusett, who reportedly gave extensive rewrites to director Gary Sherman without O'Bannon's consent. Oddly, as the film gained cult status decades later, O'Bannon softened his stance. In an interview just before his death, he called the film deeply flawed but deeply personal. Why the change of heart? Some believe he recognized how prophetic its themes had become: identity, manipulation, and the erasure of death. Others suggest guilt. Dead and Buried was the one story where he played God, then walked away. But in this town, no one walks away for long. Fact 3. The original poster was designed to look like a mortuary display. It wasn't a marketing strategy, it was a provocation. The original U.S. theatrical poster for Dead and Buried showed a woman's head partially buried in dirt, eyes closed, with soft lighting mimicking the sterile beauty of a funeral parlor. It didn't scream horror, it whispered aftermath. The tagline? It will take your breath away. All of it. Critics called it tasteless. Church groups protested. Some theaters refused to display it altogether, replacing it with generic slasher art. But the image stuck. It was designed by a little-known advertising firm that specialized in cosmetics branding, which explained the eerily made-up look of the corpse. According to legend, test audiences thought it was an ad for embalming services, not a horror film. But wasn't that the point? Death made beautiful. Decay stylized. How do you market a film about corpses that smile? You show one, smiling. Fact 4. A lawsuit nearly buried the director before the film premiered. Just weeks before its release, Dead and Buried became the center of a legal firestorm. Director Gary Sherman was slapped with a cease and desist from an uncredited effects artist who claimed the film had used his prototype corpse rig without proper attribution or payment. The dispute revolved around a pivotal scene where a character's face caves in mid-scream, a sequence praised for its uncanny realism. The artist argued that his experimental latex composition, originally built for a shelved medical training video, had been stolen after a studio merger and ended up in the film. Sherman, facing the threat of court-ordered delays, settled quietly. No names were added to the credits. But here's the catch. The artist later disappeared from the industry entirely, and no one can locate the original design plans. Some suggest that the face rig worked too well, and that's why it was buried. But others whisper a darker theory. What if it wasn't a rig at all? Fact 5. The town in the film is real and they still don't talk about it. Potter's Bluff, the haunting seaside town where Dead and Buried unfolds, is actually Mendocino, California, a quiet, picturesque coastal village. At first, the locals welcomed the production, jobs were created, and the economy briefly flourished. But after the premiere, something shifted. Residents began refusing interviews. Businesses quietly removed any memorabilia tied to the film. The town's tourism office even omitted Dead and Buried from its list of productions shot there, while happily promoting more family-friendly titles like Murder, She Wrote. Some speculate that the darker elements of the script, particularly scenes involving manipulated corpses filmed in residential homes, crossed an unspoken boundary. One former resident said in an anonymous blog post, "They left props behind. We thought they were fake, but not all of them were." What exactly was left behind in Mendocino, and why won't anyone acknowledge it? Fact 6. The film was submitted to a medical ethics board by mistake. In one of the strangest clerical errors in film history, an early cut of Dead and Buried was accidentally submitted to the American Board of Bioethics as part of a university's academic film review. The board, which normally reviews documentaries and dramatizations involving end-of-life care, was reportedly deeply disturbed by what they perceived as a serious proposal on human reanimation. A 1,980 memo, later leaked, noted that the film suggests a procedural normalization of post-mortem consciousness restoration, with disturbing implications for consent and identity. Of course, the board had missed the point. It was fiction, but the fact that trained bioethicists mistook it for speculative research raises unsettling questions. Was the film simply that convincing? Or had it tapped into debates we weren't ready to have? When horror begins to blur with academic concern, who's really in control of the narrative, the creators, or the culture that consumes it? Fact 7. The smiling corpse became a marketing nightmare. The film's most haunting image, victims smiling moments before or after death, was never intended as a motif. During test screenings, however, audiences kept fixating on it. They weren't frightened, they were unnerved. One executive from Avco Embassy reportedly said, "People weren't gasping, they were fidgeting. That's worse." This prompted the studio to recut the trailer, emphasizing gore over psychological dread. But the marketing backfired. Viewers arrived expecting a standard splatterfest, only to be confronted with existential horror. Reviews were brutal. Variety called it moodily directionless, and the New York Times accused it of hiding its emptiness behind grotesque tableaus. In a strange twist, though, it was the smiles, those brief, twisted moments of post-mortem serenity that endured. Years later, critics began re-evaluating the film as a meditation on control, stillness, and the aesthetics of death. So, was the discomfort a flaw, or the point? Dead and Buried didn't scream, it grinned. Fact 8. The special effects team invented a makeup material that was never used again. To achieve the film's lifelike decomposition effects, Stan Winston's crew developed a new synthetic gelatin compound nicknamed Skingless. It was hyper-translucent, could be dyed to match live skin, and, under heat, melted in slow ripples, perfect for scenes of bodies reanimating or distorting. But after filming wrapped, the formula was never reused. Not in any film, not even by Winston himself. Industry rumors suggested the compound had an unstable shelf life, emitting fumes that caused nausea on set. Others believed it was simply too convincing, pushing horror effects into the uncanny valley and triggering unintended audience revulsion. A single surviving sheet of Skingless was once auctioned on eBay but mysteriously pulled before the sale concluded. Some effects historians believe the material blurred the line between cinematic illusion and biological mimicry, and Hollywood wasn't ready for that. What happens when your makeup doesn't look like death, but feels like it? Fact 9. The hospital scene was so convincing it triggered a real 911 call. During a test screening in Los Angeles, an early version of the hospital scene where a burned victim suddenly gasps and grabs a nurse's wrist prompted a panicked audience member to call emergency services. The version shown that night had a longer, uncut take, with minimal music and documentary-style sound design. According to reports, the viewer believed it was a real-life medical emergency that had been accidentally projected. The screening was halted. Studio reps scrambled to explain. What's curious is that the scene was later edited down in the final release, with added lighting filters and musical cues to soften the realism. But the raw version? It's never been included in any official cut or collector's edition. Only a handful of people have ever seen it. Was it too real, or did it reveal something the film was otherwise careful to disguise, that some horrors, when stripped of theatrics, stop being entertainment altogether? Fact 10. The director shot multiple endings and hid them from the studio. Gary Sherman never trusted test audiences. He believed ambiguity was more powerful than resolution, and for Dead and Buried, he filmed 3 different endings, none of which were officially approved. The final theatrical cut ends with a chilling twist. The protagonist discovers he's been dead all along. But according to former crew members, alternate versions explored even more disturbing possibilities. One featured a looped narrative where the entire film restarted silently after the credits, implying the cycle of resurrection was eternal. Another ended abruptly with a still frame of a child holding a camera, suggesting someone else was orchestrating the town's horrors. These versions were shown only in private crew screenings, and Sherman reportedly refused to hand them over to the studio. Decades later, when asked why he concealed them, he replied cryptically, "Some things shouldn't be explained, especially if they weren't meant for the living. Are these endings lost, or just buried?" Fact 11. A real autopsy table was used during filming. Most horror films rely on props. Dead and Buried relied on reality. For the morgue scenes, production designers sourced a decommissioned autopsy table from a medical surplus auction. It had been used in an actual pathology lab in San Francisco during the 1,960 seconds. While this added authenticity to the set, it also brought with it a strange atmosphere. Crew members reported feeling uneasy while working around it, especially when shooting extended takes. Actor Jack Albertson allegedly refused to lie on it, demanding a replica be built instead. Oddly enough, the scene where the table appears most prominently was shot in a single take, after which the production quietly replaced the item and never used it again. Was it superstition or sensitivity? Or perhaps, in a film obsessed with the boundary between the real and the dead, the line had simply been crossed too far. How close is too close? When the fiction bleeds into flesh. Fact 12. The film was marketed as a slasher to hide its philosophical core. By 1981, the slasher genre had saturated the horror market. To ensure ticket sales, the studio pitched Dead and Buried as another entry in the blood and blades trend, despite the film's existential underpinnings. Trailers emphasized brief moments of violence, omitting the eerie pacing and dialogue-heavy scenes. Posters compared it to Friday the 13th and the Fog films that shared little in common beyond mood. But once audiences sat down, they were trapped in a slow, suffocating narrative about memory, identity, and the morality of resurrection. This bait-and-switch approach led to confusion and poor reviews at the time. Yet, ironically, it's that mismatch that later made the film stand out. It wasn't a slasher, it was a moral labyrinth with corpses for signposts. Was this false advertising, or a clever trick to lure people into facing ideas they wouldn't otherwise choose to confront? Fact 13. Jack Albertson was dying during filming and he knew it. Best remembered for his role in Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory, Jack Albertson took on the role of the sinister coroner in Dead and Buried, with a quiet intensity that unsettled even his co-stars. What few knew at the time was that Albertson was battling terminal cancer during production. He insisted on continuing, despite declining health, often retreating to oxygen tanks between takes. His portrayal of a man who calmly orchestrates the manipulation of death took on a haunting double, meaning this was a performance not just near death, but through it. Sherman later recalled that Albertson treated the role as if he were already on the other side, looking back. His final lines in the film, soft, calm, and chilling, were reportedly improvised. Watching him now, one can't help but wonder, was it acting or farewell? Fact 14. The camera was treated like a killer. From the first frame, Dead and Buried establishes the camera not as a passive observer, but as an active threat. In fact, cinematographer Stephen Poster revealed that Sherman gave one direct instruction: shoot like the camera wants to murder someone. This philosophy influenced every dolly move and static shot deliberate, slow, creeping like a predator. The most unsettling scenes often featured no blood, just the feeling of being watched. One infamous sequence has the camera zoom in on a character's face as if it's preparing to strike, only to hold the frame until the actor looks directly into the lens. That tension between viewer and viewed becomes unbearable. Was it voyeurism, surveillance, possession? The visual language suggested that the camera itself was complicit in the town's secret rituals. In Dead and Buried, you don't just watch the horror, you inherit its gaze. Fact 15. A key scene was shot with no script, no sound, and no direction. One of the film's most surreal moments, where a fisherman watches a body slowly drift ashore, wasn't planned. The script originally called for a basic discovery scene with dialogue and exposition, but on the morning of the shoot, Sherman tore the page out and instructed the actor, "Just walk, don't say a word, don't react, let the ocean do the talking." The scene was filmed in complete silence, with the actor unaware of where the body prop would appear. The result was a raw, unfiltered expression of numb horror. When the scene was edited, sound design replaced dialogue. Distant gulls, the low hum of the wind, and finally, the soft squelch of waterlogged flesh. The studio wanted it cut. Sherman refused. It's now considered one of the most chilling moments in the film, not because of what's shown, but because of what isn't. In a story full of the undead, it was silence that truly spoke. Fact 16. The town's newspaper was a fully functional prop with real headlines. One blink and you miss a detail that has since become legendary among prop designers. The local newspaper used in Dead and Buried was fully typeset, page by page, with actual readable content. Production designer Philip Harrison insisted that even throwaway props reflect the world's logic. So instead of blank filler or lorem ipsum, the paper's articles told local news stories of missing pets, odd behavior in town council meetings, and a chilling op-ed titled, "When the Dead Return, Who Pays the Taxes?" No close-up ever lingers on these pages, but in high-definition restorations, you can read the entire thing. Fans have since analyzed every column, searching for hidden messages or clues to the town's secret. Some claim one editorial subtly hints that the coroner has been in power for over 70 years. Whether intentional or accidental, the question remains: how much of Dead and Buried's horror was hiding in plain sight? Fact 17. The composer hid a heartbeat beneath the score. Joe Renzetti's eerie, minimal score has long been praised for its quiet dread, but few realize what's pulsing just beneath the surface. In an interview years later, Renzetti admitted that many tracks in the film's soundtrack contain a sub-bass frequency mimicking a slowed human heartbeat. Played just below the audible threshold, it wasn't meant to be heard, it was meant to be felt. This inaudible rhythm was embedded into scenes involving reanimation, morgue transitions, and long tracking shots through empty streets. The idea was to create physiological unease without the audience understanding why. It worked. Test viewers reportedly shifted uncomfortably during scenes with little action, describing a sense of wrongness they couldn't explain. Modern screenings have verified the subfrequency using spectrogram analysis. So next time you rewatch the film, ask yourself, is that your own pulse or the town's? Fact 18. The VHS cover art was designed to repulse retailers. In the home video boom of the 80 seconds, horror films often competed for shelf space with garish, over-the-top artwork. Dead and Buried took the opposite approach. Its VHS cover was intentionally muted, featuring a grainy, desaturated photo of a grave mound with a single daisy sticking out. No blood, no faces, just the quiet suggestion of aftermath. Why? Because the studio believed controversy sells. They assumed that retailers would balk at the image's funereal tone, and they were right. Many stores initially refused to display the tape, fearing customer complaints. The ban only fueled curiosity. Underground rental shops began marketing it as the horror film your local store is afraid to carry. It became a cult object not through shock, but through subtle defiance. In an era of screaming skulls and slashing knives, Dead and Buried chose to whisper, and somehow that was louder. Fact 18. The VHS cover art was designed to repulse retailers. In the home video boom of the 80 seconds, horror films often competed for shelf space with garish, over-the-top artwork. Dead and Buried took the opposite approach. Its VHS cover was intentionally muted, featuring a grainy, desaturated photo of a grave mound with a single daisy sticking out. No blood, no faces, just the quiet suggestion of aftermath. Why? Because the studio believed controversy sells. Fact 19. The film's copyright changed hands, then mysteriously reverted. In 1983, just 2 years after Dead and Buried's release, its copyright was sold in a package deal to a minor distribution company based out of Florida. The company went bankrupt within a year, and for a brief period, the film was considered orphaned, meaning no clear legal owner could be identified. Was it simply a clerical correction, or did someone want the film back under wraps? In a story defined by resurrection and erasure, even its legal history feels undead. Fact 20. A frame was intentionally spliced backwards and no one knows why. At exactly 1 hour, 7 minutes, and 43 seconds into the film, there's a frame, just one, that plays in reverse. It happens during a slow tracking shot through the fog as the protagonist walks down an empty street. To the naked eye, it's imperceptible, but frame by frame analysis confirms it. A split-second stutter where the fog folds in on itself, as if inhaling rather than drifting. Some have dismissed it as an editing mistake, but an assistant editor, who asked to remain anonymous, claimed the reversal was deliberate and done by Sherman himself, late in the cutting process. He said it was like blinking, the editor recalled, like the town seeing you back. Whether it's symbolic, subliminal, or pure aesthetic noise, that one reversed frame has sparked decades of obsessive theories. Maybe it means nothing, but in Dead and Buried, even nothing seems to come back to life. Bonus fact: the film was once screened at a memorial service. It sounds like a myth, but the documentation exists. In 1994, a private memorial service held in upstate New York for a recently deceased film professor included a projection of Dead and Buried as part of the event's closing ritual. According to attendees, the film had been one of the deceased's personal obsessions. He wrote his doctoral thesis on mortality in cinema and considered Dead and Buried the most honest horror film ever made about the fear of forgetting. The screening was unannounced. Guests assumed it would be a traditional slideshow or eulogy. Instead, the lights dimmed, and the film began without introduction. No one stopped it. Some stayed, some left. When the end credits rolled, the projector simply clicked off, and no further words were spoken. The choice was polarizing, but hauntingly appropriate. In a story about corpses resurrected to maintain the illusion of normalcy, what better mirror could there be for our rituals of remembrance? Was it tasteless or transcendent? Maybe Dead and Buried was never really a horror film. Maybe it was a question, left unanswered on purpose. If we can bring the body back, but not the soul, should we? Now it's your turn to dig. Which fact unsettled you the most, and do you believe Dead and Buried was misunderstood, or was it always meant to be hidden? Tell us in the comments. Was this just a forgotten cult horror, or a meditation on death disguised as entertainment? And if you know another film that hides something beneath the surface, suggest it below. We might just exhume it next.